Not at all. Not at all.
If we would bow our heads for a moment of prayer. Heavenly Father, we humbly thank you for all the blessings you bestowed upon us. Thank you, Lord, for friends and family. Thank you, Lord, for our participants today. Let them bring words of wisdom throughout. We ask all these blessings in Jesus' name, Christ our Redeemer. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Good evening, everybody. Once again, my name is Alex Jones, and I'm the boss list of the Epsilon Iota Iota chapter of Omega Psi-Phi Fraternity Incorporated. On behalf of the chapter brotherhood, I welcome you to our continued Omega Uplift Series, which is focused on COVID-19 and other key issues and its impact in the Black community. Since our founding 109 years ago on the campus of Howard University, we've been guided by our four cardinal principles of manhood, scholarship, perseverance, and uplift. Omega has played and continues to play a vital role in the social and economic growth of our country and enhancing the lives of African Americans. We operate under 10 nationally mandated programs, which are centralized around issues in our communities. As a chapter, these programs address social action, education, health initiatives, and voter registration and mobilization. Tonight's topic, we will discuss leveraging our power in the fight for racial equality. While we all have witnessed protests and unrest around the senseless killing within the African American community, the Social Action Committee felt it was most appropriate at this time to start having further conversations with a local and national perspective. I would like to take the time to thank our esteemed panelists for agreeing to participate and give their expertise on this very important topic. Before we start, I would like to share a few reminders. All participants will be muted, but during this presentation, we encourage your activity. We encourage you to actively participate by utilizing the chat features. All questions will be acknowledged at the appropriate time by Brother Ruel Dixon. And now our series moderator is a brother who plays a key role in Omega on not only a chapter level, but also the district and international levels. He is also no stranger to the greater New Haven community, where he serves as a head coach, a mentor, a leader, as well as an advocate. I will now turn it over to our Social Action Chairman and our Omega Uplift Series moderator, Brother Kevin Walton. We hope you enjoy the program.
Good evening. Thank you, Brother Bossless. And thank you for spearheading this event. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being with us this evening. We are excited to continue our series around COVID-19, but given all the things that have gone on, we've made a little pivot, and we are just going to discuss a lot of things that are going on in our country today and in our communities. We are excited to have with us people that are going to bring you some real power, going to bring some real heat, and they're going to bring some real talk to you this evening. So please, as Brother Bossa said, engage in the chat room. I will allow the panelists to tell a little bit more about themselves, but just to let you know, tonight we have with us Carrie Ellington, who is a local activist here in New Haven, Brother Charles Coleman, attorney Brother Charles Coleman out of New York City, and of course, Brother Attorney Michael Jefferson here in New Haven, Connecticut. And so without further ado, we are going to go ahead and get started. On August 3rd, 1857, in a speech in Canandaigua, New York, Frederick Douglass declared, "If there is no struggle, there is no progress." During his same speech, Mr. Douglass also poignantly proclaimed that this struggle may be a moral one, or it may be a physical one, and it may be both moral and physical, but it must be a struggle. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. Find out just what any people will quietly submit to, and you have found out the exact measure of injustice and wrong which will be imposed upon them. And these will continue till they are resisted in either words or blows, or with both. The May 25th, 2020 murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and the March 13th, 2020 murder of Breonna Taylor in Louisville, Kentucky, have led to a month-long protest by American people who are demanding not only justice, but a complete overhaul into how law enforcement polices Black and brown bodies and Black-brown communities. Between the economic and physical toll that COVID-19 has taken, as well as the civil rights unrest that is taking place, we're going to begin with our panelists by asking, what are your thoughts on where we are as a nation today? And I'll start with Brother Jefferson.
Good evening, everyone. And Brother Basilis, Brother Social Action Chair, Brother Ruel Dixon, and all the other brothers and sisters who are on the call this evening. And I just want to commend you for your Uplift series. It is a pleasure to be here and to have been invited by my home chapter, Epsilon Iota Iota. So I'm happy to be here. We're in a horrible place in American society today. You know, I heard Will Smith or read a quote by Will Smith. He said, racism isn't getting worse, it's just getting filmed. And I just thought that was so powerful because he's absolutely correct. We live in a society, and folks have to understand that what we're dealing with is a socialization process. And the socialization process in America works like this. Whites are socialized to believe they are superior to all others. Blacks are socialized under that same system to believe we are inferior to them. Men are socialized to believe we are superior to women. And so by definition, all whites, to some degree, harbor racist sentiments. All men harbor sexist sentiments. All blacks, to some degree, harbor sentiments that can be construed as self-hating in nature. These are hard to accept facts, but we have to if we're gonna move on. And when I say that, when you understand the socialization process, you must understand that the police force is a microcosm of the larger society. The way someone is socialized doesn't magically disappear simply because they become a police officer or a firefighter or a doctor or a teacher or an accountant, so on and so forth. They still bring that socialization process with them. And so what we have witnessed over the past 2 centuries of policing is that socialization process in full effect. The bedrock principle of policing in this society is about the protection of white life and the preservation of white property. That is clear. The policing began with the whole notion of the paddy roller system, the slave catchers. And of course, we know that it's been transformed over the years, but it doesn't mean that the bedrock principle of law enforcement has changed. You talk about this struggle for racial equality, and I want to just read a quote from someone who I consider a mentor, in the sense that I've read his books and I've listened to commentary of him prior to his passing. It's the late Derek Bell, the first Black tenured Harvard law professor. And he wrote this in a book called Faces at the Bottom of the Well. He said, Black people will never gain full equality in this country. Even those Herculean efforts we hail as successful will produce no more than temporary peaks of progress, short-lived victories that slide into irrelevance as racial patterns adapt in ways that maintain white dominance. This is a hard to accept fact that all history verifies. We must acknowledge it, not as a sign of submission, but as an act of ultimate defiance. I'm gonna leave it there because I wanna hear from the other panelists, but I'm gonna get a little deeper into that because I think it's so relevant today. Thank you.
Thank you, Brother Jefferson. Carrie, same question. Where are we as a nation today?
I just echo what I heard Michael saying. We are in Connecticut, the work on the ground that I've been helping to support and be a part of organizing, we found in the past 4 years that over 30 people on public record have been killed in interactions with police across the state. Most of those over 30 people, right, have been mostly Black and brown folks. Most of those folks in Connecticut have been mostly young folks, teenagers, 20-somethings, again, mostly over petty allegations of property theft. And I think when I think of the place that we are in society in America, it's a deeply sad and violent place that we live in. Speaking to the numbers that I just gave to you all, that it's legally sanctioned for police to come into our communities and to kill and or murder us and get impunity by the law. So if that in addition to other state apparatuses that keep us in a depressed economic system and in a depressed a status as a people, regardless as to how hard we work and we try to overcome and to succeed, that these systems and the state apparatus is really violent against us as a people. So I think we are in a deeply troubled place in this country, and we have a lot of organizing cut out for us.
Great, thank you. Brother Coleman.
Thank you, Kevin, and thank you, EII, for having me. Brother Jefferson said a lot of what has been my conversation over the past few weeks. But what I will say is I think that we are currently in a state of reckoning. We right now are holding up a very clear mirror and a very clear looking glass to America around its sordid history with anti-Blackness. We are right now holding up a mirror that illuminates systemic oppression on a number of different levels. And I think that it is incumbent upon us as a community, even in the midst of a global pandemic, which I'll talk a little bit about later in terms of the extreme dynamic that plays in terms of the fluidity of organizing and of movement spaces and how that affects those things. Even within a pandemic, we have a responsibility to ensure that our political memories are not shortened. Unfortunately, in our community, we have sometimes too short of political memories in that we forget that America has maintained state-sanctioned institutions of violence, be they physical, psychological, or financial, against Black America for as long as there has been Black America. And so when we have this conversation about where we are, it is important that we maintain appropriate political memories about the fact that violence in America has always been its first language against our community in a variety of different forms. And that violence has always been state sanctioned. And so it's important that as we process conversations around anti-Blackness and what it has been globally, of course, but also very germane to what we're talking about right now within the United States, that our political memories are in fact well-informed and that they're as long as they can be, because that is what fuels the need for such a deep and comprehensive reckoning around racial and social injustice as it relates to us and our community. There has been a lot of commercialization around racial reckoning in the past weeks because it's fashionable and it's trendy, and that should be of great concern to us. I think that we have allowed people to tell us how they want to engage racial reconciliation without them being obligated to listen to us around how to do that. And that is a setup for failure. That is what happens when you see things that we did not ask for, like kente cloth on Capitol Hill or Aunt Jemima being eliminated, as opposed to substantive dialogue around race, racial justice and social justice and racial reconciliation and race equity taking place in meaningful ways. And so we have to be careful as a community to make sure that we do not allow this popularization of Black Lives Matter on a on a surface level to overshadow or drown out the voices that are coming from movement spaces that have very clear, very concrete, very substantive demands about moving things forward.
Great. All right. So then that leads right into the next question, and then Brother Coleman, I'll let you go ahead. So then, given that you said that we're going to have to be careful and mindful of how people interact with us, and we need to control our own narrative around these things. So what are the next steps in the movement?
So I think in order to understand what the next steps in the movement are, people have to understand how movement spaces work. I think that one of the problems that we have in our community is that we sort of are ignorant, and I don't mean that in any pejorative manner, about the different facets of movement spaces. So for example, people look at protesters and they say, oh, they don't got to be out there burning stuff up and so on and so forth, or causing trouble, et cetera, et cetera. And what that says to me is that that is a very clear demonstration that people do not understand what protest actually does. Protest is space making. It is space making to create space for conversations that are not already being had. And in some cases, protest is about economic restriction of those things that are allowing state-sanctioned violence, like I described earlier, to continue to take place. I say that because people need to understand the same people who are outside on the street marching, getting tear gassed, doing that, you know, in those spaces are not necessarily going to be the same people who are making the demands in other places and speaking truth to power. They are creating space to work with one another, just like the same space, the same people may not necessarily be in the conversation in media, for example, helping to make sure that the narrative stays appropriately on target and doesn't turn into some denatured fake news. So when you ask what is the next step of the movement, it's important that we understand that there are a number of organizations on the ground in community, networks of organizations, Movement for Black Lives. I mean, I could name tons of them off the top of my head that have come together and articulated specific demands nationally around police reform, around healthcare, around creating equity in a number of different spaces for communities of color. I think it's incumbent upon all of us to familiarize ourselves with these platforms and these asks so that we can speak intelligently about them when we are in conversation with others. Because, for example, the conversation about defunding police and divesting certain funds into other areas, as soon as it was introduced, as soon as that narrative came out, just as quickly, you saw the narrative get hijacked, or there was an attempt to hijack that narrative and take it in a direction which it was never intended to do. We can't combat that if we're not informed. So it's incumbent upon all of us to make sure that we're as informed about sort of the asks that have been made on behalf of our community so that we can articulate them. And then we have to re-examine our civic engagement. I'm sure at some point somebody on this conversation is going to talk about the importance of voting and being involved and so on and so forth. That's not where I'm going with it. When I say civic engagement, I'm talking about a much greater sophisticated conversation in terms of being on top of legislation, understanding what is already, pending, what has already passed that's not being enforced, and what needs to be introduced. So that's going to require a greater effort on our part, and continuing to follow up and hold those who are quote unquote in power accountable.
Right, and we're going to get into the legislative part of the agenda a little later. And so thank you for bringing that up. So Carrie, what are the next steps in the movement?
I think we need a lot of dialogue within our community, within the movement. I've seen a lot of infighting, not just like locally, but nationally. I think we are very siloed as a community and need to figure out how we can build more inclusive movements and need to be comfortable and okay with building inclusive movements, right? I see of people who denounce the Black Lives Matter movement within our community because they feel that they may be wielding some specific kind of motive or agenda, right? So in order for us to really build a true powerful movement, that we have to talk about the nuances in our community and talk about what it means when we say Black Lives Matter, and talk about what it means to mean that all Black lives matter and not just some, right? Not just cisgender folks and not just cisgender heterosexual men, right? That women are being killed and that we don't come out as a community, Black women, right? When we're killed and come on the front lines like we do when we see brothers being killed. That when trans Black folks are murdered, that we step up and we be just as loud, right, about a Tony McDade as we are a George Floyd. So I think that we need, in order to really succeed, that we need to be more critical within our community around issues of transphobia, homophobia, other issues that keep us from really coming together fully, right, as our full whole selves, without compromise, and addressing the agendas that we need to address for ourselves as a people. So I think there needs to be a lot of dialogue, a lot of education, a lot of being critical and pushing back against what is traditional and what we think of as needed because we've been informed by our tradition. So that's I add, and I want to hear other folks.
Kevin, I want to jump in on that point very, very quickly.
All right, go ahead.
And I think it's important, right? I do agree with Kerry that there's definitely a need around dialogue in these spaces. And I think it's important to have this conversation because at the end of the day, like, this is a community space. And so having these conversations in community is critical. A lot of people wouldn't know this, right? Because Kerry's point is valid, right? From the public standpoint, there is a hesitance to engage certain movement spaces because of the perception around, you know, how intersectionality may be opening the movement to, you know, again, perception being hijacked by the queer community, right? That is a thing. That's like one of the dirty little secrets that's not really that much of a secret in our community.
It's not as much of a secret.
And then, but the other side to it, right? And this is where I'm also, I don't want to call it a pushback with Kerry, but I do think that it also warrants commenting. Having been in movement spaces myself, there's very much so the need to have a conversation about where do we create space from a leadership standpoint for cis heterosexual Black men to be a part of that conversation. Because I can tell you from firsthand experience that being in those spaces and not being a man who identifies as gay, I can oftentimes be looked at with great skepticism because of how I show up. I'm very clear about the fact that straight Black men have done a significant amount of harm to people in the queer community, as well as to Black women, be they straight or gay. I'm also very clear about the fact that straight Black men historically have arguably done a significant amount of harm to movement spaces, which is why, in terms of the modern day movement, whether you look at Ferguson, whether you look at other parts of the movement, people have made very intentional efforts not to put forward a straight Black man in the image of a MLK or Martin Luther King or Malcolm X or Medgar Evers, because they did not want to go down that road again. Understand that, totally clear. But I think that there's equally warranted a conversation about, are we doing the same thing in reverse within movement spaces as far as not creating room for the voices of straight Black males, ironically, when a large part of who we're standing up for are straight Black males. So I think that also is a part of just like this need for greater dialogue. I think Kerry is right, but I also think that goes both ways, because a lot of people would not think that, they wouldn't know it, but having been in those spaces myself, it's real. And it threatens to be problematic because it creates greater infighting among us that delays our progress.
All right, so I'm gonna switch gears and get this next question to Brother Jefferson, but I just want to leave it out there in the parking lot to say, in the past couple of years, the movements that I've been a part of and watching, and it have been women leading the movements, and I guess the question probably maybe begs to say, where are those men that you speak about? Because some of the side conversations I hear about are saying, oh, well, Black Lives Matter is, they're funded by these white folks and it's not real. Or today, a good friend of mine was posting something about, the movement being hijacked by gay women who are ostracizing Black men. So I agree with both points that it's a conversation that needs to be had, but we also, I think we can agree that we can't allow that to derail our movement and our momentum. So,
and Kevin, I agree with you. I think those are peripheral issues when you look at the broader context of struggle. First, big ups, big major ups to Black Lives Matter. I don't care who's leading it. Big ups because they are out there leading protests that has impacted the entire world. And we have to acknowledge that and recognize that. And, I don't care if the protest goes on from today until the cows come home. Protest. So I'm absolutely in support of Black Lives Matter. I don't care who's leading Black Lives Matter. And I do think that each of us have to undergo self-reflection to confront our own phobias and our own issues. As I opened up this dialogue, Black people in this country have been socialized to think a certain way about ourselves, and we have not dealt with that internalization of how we view ourselves. And so we demand that white people confront and own their racism, because I don't own racism. I own my sexism and I own my self-hatred. But and that's my burden. Those are my burdens, and that means I have to confront that. Whites have to confront their racism, and so we all have to do our part in terms of self-reflection and understand where we come up short. Now, to answer your question about the next step, and I'm going to let the folks listening in on a little secret about Omega Sci-Fi. So, years ago, when we're pledging, and brothers used to, commonly say to the lamps that it's harder to be a brother than it is to be a lamp, and we said that religiously, and so we and if you use that metaphor, and we look at struggle, moving to the aftermath, the next step is very, very difficult, right? So Brother Coleman touched on it. This year represents 55 years. It's the 55th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act, the most significant piece of legislation for Black people in modern history. Of course, you had the 13th Amendment, which basically abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment made us citizens. The 15th Amendment gave Black men the right to vote, not Black women. And of course, the 19th Amendment gave women the right to vote. But the South implemented all kinds of obstacles that prevented us from exercising that franchise, that right to vote. And so in 65, after the protests, now, that's why protests are so important. It drove the federal government to the table, and Johnson signed the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which struck down these barriers, these poll taxes, and all these other barriers that prevented Black people from exercising our right to vote. That was significant because it led to political empowerment. Now, in 2013, in a case called Shelby County versus Holder, Eric Holder was the petitioner as the Attorney General, the Supreme Court defanged the Voting Rights Act. They gutted it. And they did that by, in a 5-4 vote, and they said that Section 4B was unconstitutional because what they did in the Voting Rights Act initially was use a coverage formula, and it said that certain states that had a history of establishing barriers had to conform to a certain coverage formula. When they struck down that coverage formula, they allowed these states now to say, and they struck it down because they said, oh, those barriers no longer exist as they did 40 years ago. So these states are free to do whatever they wanted to do. And guess what they did? Since they struck down the voting, the 4B, Section 4B of the Voting Rights Act, they didn't even get to Section 5 of that act because it was no need once they struck down Section 4B. Section 5 named all the states that were guilty. So they didn't even get to that. But since they struck that down, they have closed over nearly 1,700 polling places across the South. They've closed them down, shut them down, because now this is about voter suppression. Yeah, I want to talk about the need to vote, but more importantly, and this is what the Kiyama movement, which I founded, is doing through an initiative called Black Men Vote Too, which you're very much aware of, Kevin, is trying to teach our young people how to become sophisticated voters, how to properly vet candidates, how to be independent thinkers, how to recognize political hacks and mercenaries, how to understand the political process in a given municipality. These are very important things that we have to do in terms of moving forward. I think it's the ballot or the bullet. That's all it is. It's the ballot or the bullet. And I choose the ballot because I think if we get our act together as a people, and it doesn't have to take all of us, but it has to take enough of us, and particularly young people who are not co-opted or corrupted by the older generation. To become sophisticated voters has to be the goal. To become independent thinkers, to understand that all that glitters isn't gold. That is very important. To understand the rules of the game is very, very important. How not to be seduced by the gift of gab so that folks can talk that vote right out of your pocket. That's the next step in this, in our struggle. That is the aftermath.
So, and thank you for that, Brother Jefferson. So I just want to follow with a question for you. So how would you respond if I say the freedom that we say we're looking for is rooted in our political astutely and our political empowerment?
I'll say you're absolutely correct. I think you're 100% correct. You see, what Malcolm talked about in his famous speech, The Ballot or the Bullet, he gave in Detroit in *64, when he spoke about that, I think Malcolm took it for granted and basically felt like we have to control the politics of our own community is what he was talking about. Mm-hmm. And we took it to mean simply that if Black people were in power, then we're controlling our own community. We know that is not true at all. It's not just the Black face in high places that matters. It's the right faces in high places that matter. So I'm not looking at a person's hue. I'm looking at how we think about this political process. How are we independent thinkers? Because every time you turn around, we're registering folks to vote and we tell them to vote, but no one is educating these young people about how to vote. No one is telling them the rules of the game. So we do things like this. Let me give you a quick example. So you have a person in this area running for state senate re-election, and you have someone challenging him. Folks don't understand that the person who's running right now is chair of the Judiciary Committee, a very powerful committee at the state level in the Senate. Very powerful because they vet the judges, they vet the commissioners who sit on these powerful boards and commissions. Now, if this individual was to lose that race, and he's doing a phenomenal job, and I'm not endorsing, I'm just using an example, but if he loses that race and the new person comes in, we lose that seniority. And this is a Black man. We lose that seniority. Whoever comes in goes to the bottom of the food chain, and we lose judiciary. If you don't understand that, we'll make the mistake time and time again of voting out people who are operating in our best interest and who have some senior status in the electoral process. The other point is this, Kev. Most of the change that we're talking about happens at the local and state level. We have to look at the local level. For example, I'll give you one last example that I'll be quiet and let the other panelists get in. We have a board of police commissioners right here in this city. Now, whoever controls the board of police commissioners in this city controls oversight with the police. You don't need an all civilian review board. That is the all civilian review board, is the police board of police commissioner. The mayor appoints that person. So the mayor just recently appointed someone, never came to the community with the person's name, just threw out this person from Yale and said, let her be on the board of police commissioners. Never vetted by the community. Now, if you want to control the police, then you got to control the CEO of this city who makes those kind of appointments. Not only do he control the individual who sit on the board of police commissioners, but he controls the chief of police. And we have to understand that we can't complain and sit around and get angry all the time when we have the power in our hands to make a difference, Kevin.
Absolutely. And I think that's a whole nother conversation to have in terms of our political awareness, our political astuteness, and when you talk about all politics being local. So listen, we're gonna switch gears. So Ruel, do we have any questions, any statements in the chat that we want to share right now?
Yes, we have a few. I'll just do one for right now. All right. Systems of oppression are rooted in white supremacy and male supremacy, heterosexual dominance, able-bodyism, classism. So anti-oppressive efforts must intentionally center those who have been marginalized, creating such spaces of equity for all. Question to the panelists. Systems of oppression hurt those who are centered as well as those who are marginalized. Any thoughts from the panel on how to make white community members recognize that they have lost by maintaining systems of oppression?
What was that last piece? To make whites?
Any thoughts from the panel on how to make the white community members recognize that they have lost by maintaining systems of oppression?
Well, I think, the first comment was something I think Karen had said, and I responded to Karen in the chat. But that's a really interesting question to see that they have lost. I think that at the end of the day, for me, for a white person who inherently will benefit from white supremacy, trying to convince them that they are not winning is like trying to convince the Bulls in the 90s that they weren't a great dynasty. They are winning. It's set up to win because the game is not a level playing field. I think that the only sort of pathway that I see in terms of having that conversation is appealing to someone's humanity and understanding that by denigrating or compromising or lessening or attempting to lessen or investing in or supporting systems that do not recognize the humanity of all people in an equal way, that you are basically a participant in something that detracts and lowers and lessens your own humanity. So essentially by being a part of or contributing or standing idly by and letting oppressive systems just do what they do, whether you're actively a participant or you're just passively a beneficiary, you lose a part of your own humanity. Now, that appeal may or may not be very persuasive, but I don't know that you can make, the other panelists can feel free to disagree with me, but I don't know that you can make an argument to folks who are white to say, well, by supporting these systems, you're not winning. I don't know that you can do that, but at least not in good stead.
Yeah, as far as I'm concerned, I'm not interested in talking to white people about that sort of stuff. I'm not here to educate white people about anything like that. I'll deal with the anti-racist white people, but I'm not wasting my precious time trying to educate white people about their nonsense. That's on them. It's incumbent upon them. They started it. They need to finish it. They need to own their racism, and that's just the bottom line. I don't see why Black people should shoulder that burden. Quite frankly, I just don't care about what they think about this or what they think about that. In fact, a lot of white people don't think we could teach them anything. Some are not even interested in listening to us. So, or hearing us, or believe what we're saying is true. For years, Black people was talking about, telling white people about what was going on out there in terms of police brutality in our community, and they did nothing about it. They did nothing about it. They didn't even believe it. In fact, when they first saw it back in the 90s, early 90s, 91, when Rodney King got beaten to within an inch of his life, they still let those cops off in Simi Valley. Even after, and they deluded themselves into believing he did something wrong. So I'm not interested in all of that. I'll align myself with anti-racist whites. Outside of that, if you're not on that journey, I really don't have much use for you, quite frankly.
All right, Carrie?
Yeah, I think we can in part do that by naming, white supremacy and white violence for what it is. I think we oftentimes, Michael said the word dilute, we oftentimes dilute the way that whiteness and white supremacy shows up, and we name it very passively as a society. This is what we do, right? So like if you all just saw the attacks of like this mob of white people on Worcester Square, if you are living in New Haven, a few days ago, there was a mob of old white men that attacked these peaceful assemblers, or what I thought were being peaceful assemblers. And the media characterized it as a conflict, as a brief racial fight, as if it was equal on both ends. And I think that we often we internalize giving white people a pass and naming their violence as other things, and we just need to name it as white violence, right? That white supremacy is upheld by white violence, and white people have to manage that violence. And what do you lose when you're busy, right, throughout your life managing and controlling systems of violence, whether it be peripheral or direct and explicitly? So I think by naming those things and being very explicit about that white folks at some point, white folks who have a conscience and have empathy, at some point have to wrestle with that management of those systems. And because I think there's something about white privilege that doesn't name that for me, right? The way that white violence does. So I try to really speak to white violence in all its forms, and be explicit about that, and not find like other ways to dilute that and say it to white people when it needs to be said, not to teach them, but just because it needs to be said when it needs to be said. I also hear what Michael's saying, and I'm of attitude as well.
No, I think it's very interesting to hear the different comments from our panelists as well as our audience. I think we have a very engaged audience around these things, and we're kind of touching on various points, and we could go way left and it would still serve its purpose. But let me just bring us back, and I'll get back to where we are here. And we'll move on to talk a little bit about police reform. So while it's no secret to Black folk, and we just mentioned this, right, that police have been killing unarmed and innocent Black people since forever. These senseless murders at the hands of the police and the subsequent protests have sparked nationwide conversation about police reform and more accountability for police misconduct and acts of brutality. So I imagine that our panelists are familiar with the state Senate Republican as well as the House Democrats police overhaul bills. And for our audience, just brief history, they both increase data collection. They both want more training for law enforcement officials. Incentives for law enforcement officers to wear body cameras make lynching a federal crime. However, some big differences between the two are the Democrats want to do away with chokehold and similar maneuvers, where Republicans are encouraging narrower restrictions. Democrats would alter qualified immunity to allow victims of police brutality to seek damages. Republicans would not. Democrats would make it easier to prosecute police officers for misconduct. Republicans would call for de-escalating training for officers. The Democratic proposal plans to ban no-knock warrants in federal drug cases. The Republican bill requires agencies to report their use of no-knock warrants. The Democratic proposal calls for end to racial bias in policing. Republicans would create a training program and commission. Now, we see a lot of training being proposed by one side. But I would say this: when they could bring in mass murderers like Dylan Roof without murdering him, I like to say that their training works when it needs to work. So I'm not sure if more training is the answer. But to our panelists, what are your thoughts on these police reform bills being put forth by Congress? Do either of these bills go far enough in addressing police misconduct? And we start with you, Carrie.
So I would push back and I would say that this recent momentous moment in the movement after George Floyd's murder has really pushed a conversation around defunding and police abolition versus police reform. That in this dialogue, national dialogue, people have been really loud about police reforms not being enough. I am of the attitude that policing reforms such as the ones you just noted only land us in a place where in the past 4 years in Connecticut, right, 30 people have been killed due to police interactions that most definitely could have been de-escalated and people didn't need to lose their lives. So I believe that the foundation of policing is violent, that all policing is brutal, right? That all policing is violent, and that in policing, the fundamental equation, right, is that there's no amount of unjustified force on Black bodies. There's never any amount, right, that is justified or not, that is unjustified, excuse me. So as long as we live in that foundation of a system, to all the points Michael made earlier around being right, living on this land, that reform will only land us in a place where we may have new laws on the books, but the same violence that we see ensuing, even with body cameras, right? Even, I mean, the advent of this movement started after 2008 when people got cell phone cameras, right? And the first murder that we saw on our camera was Oscar Grant. And since Oscar Grant in 2008 to we're in, right, 2020 now, right, we've seen nothing but murder after murder, damn near day after day since that time, if you will. If someone runs the records, I'm sure it's, if not day after day, day after every other day. And so I'm not sure that body cameras are getting us to getting more police prosecuted. And if we look at the case of Stephanie Washington and Paul Witherspoon, where both officers and frankly Black officers are on camera jumping out of a car playing Call of Duty on two innocent unarmed civilians, and we still haven't seen with them having that technology of the body cameras, we still haven't seen a charge or accountability for both those officers in a real sense, in an authentic sense, in a sense that takes them off the streets because they are unfit to be on these streets, right? To be in our neighborhoods, to be in New Hallville. So I am one to say that we really need to explore as a community what it means to be literate around reforms and what it means to be literate around abolition, and making critical choices around what agenda we push for. And I'm very highly interested in pushing for defunding and defunding as a way of getting to the abolishment of police, which will take a long time, but we need to be rethinking of systems and rethinking of ways to keep our community safe outside of calling police officers who escalate problems and in many times, like I've seen, have left people dead and murdered on the streets.
Yeah, and absolutely. And I would ask you if you would talk to our audience about defunding. But I just wanted to say, so we have, so we're talking about defunding the police and abolition, and then you're talking about Washington doing their own thing. So then this whole issue of defunding, where does that fight need to be taken to?
That's a local fight that involves what Michael Jefferson was speaking of, getting engaged locally in your legislative process, getting engaged in the process, your local jurisdiction, and showing up to budget meetings to make sure that one, the police are excuse me, I'm sorry. Dogs are barking in the background, so I want to pause for now.
All right. So, Mike, you want to talk about the bills and the reform?
Yeah, well, you know, Kev, I just echo a lot of what Kerry has already addressed. but the thing about it is the Boston mayor said something very interesting a few weeks ago. He called racism a public health crisis. That's deep. That's deep to refer to it as a public, because he's right. It's a public health. It's a sickness. I mean, for you to look at someone and to judge the totality of that human being on the color of his or her skin, it's insane. It's crazy. And that's part of the socialization process. So I looked at most of the reforms that are being proposed, and of course you would embrace most of them. I mean, why not? I mean, if it moves us closer to where we're trying to go with reform, but this thing starts at the beginning. It really does. It starts with screening, with I think a psychological exam to see just how racist these people are. We know they're racist. I mean, that's insane, because if you're white in this country and you've been socialized to harbor racist sentiment, so right off the rip, it's just a question of how racist are you? Because you're giving this person a gun and you're giving this person a badge, which means they have a license to kill you or to take your liberty. And that matters. See, the reason why it doesn't matter to most whites is because they're not affected by it. In some countries, it takes years to become a police officer. In this country, it takes 21 weeks. You give us some sicko a gun and a badge, and they're ready to come into our community and for support. And that's how they're treating our people. You look at the Elijah McClain situation in rural Colorado, it's one of the saddest situations you can read about. What that man did to George Floyd is incredible. Breonna Taylor, Sandra Blunt, the list is long. It's because of how they view Black people. They view us with such contempt. I think 40% of this country hate us for no reason but merely existing. The other 40% is probably indifferent. Like, well, yeah, it's bad, but whatever.
Right.
Chairman, I want to jump in quickly. I know we are short on time, but I want to jump in quickly on this.
Hold on, Brother Coleman.
Hold on. Let Mike finish his point, and then I got you, Brother Coleman.
I'm getting old. I'm getting older here, Brother Coleman. So, but the point I want to make is that's what you're dealing with. So you look at reform, you have to begin with a screening process. You have to have a psychological exam. And I'll tell you who else needs a psychological exam. A lot of Black folks, because I want to gauge how, what exactly is their how they view the validation, their validation by white people. You see, I mean, how much does that mean to you? Because when you look at how a lot of Black officers engage our community, you have to realize that that's part of the socialization process as well. I'm gonna let Brother Coleman jump in because I know he's.
Yeah, yep, Brother Charles, you've been waiting patiently. Jump in for us.
I think first and foremost, I think Kerry is right on the point that, like, I know this is a very difficult thing for us because of how we're socialized, but we really need to reimagine what the function of police are in America and why we need them. I think that, again, I talked about early on state-sanctioned violence against Black people in America for literally as long as there have been Black people in America. And because of that, you have to understand the anti-Black root of policing. And so you can never have something that evolves from what it was started from to a degree that completely is not anything that's reminiscent of where it began, right? And part of that is education. And it is important for us to be as sophisticated about having this conversation as possible, because when we limit the discussion to these reforms, we're past the point of like what actually needs to be discussed. So I'm going to give you all some facts here. And this is, so I look at this in my current capacity as a civil rights attorney and social justice advocate, as well as in my past life as a former prosecutor. 7 out of 10 arrests in America are white people. As far as convictions, the numbers skew the complete opposite way. Well, what does that tell us? that tells us that if we focus entirely on policing, we're missing the problems with the other parts of the system. And that will only land us in the wrong space later on. We have to not allow this, the conversation on policing is important, but we have to have it the right way. But if we're going to have the conversation about policing, we cannot not have the conversation about prosecution, about the bench, and about the relationship between prosecutors and policing as being part of an entire system that is inherently anti-Black. And that's why I threw the statistic about 7 out of 10 arrests in America occurring against white people. But then if you look at incarceration rates, it's disproportionate in the opposite direction. And that's part and parcel because later on, after the violence that has been committed by police against Black people, there's an entire system waiting for Black people that is anti-Black and then messes with, you know, who gets convicted, who gets thrown in jail, how long they get thrown in jail, and so on, and what the after effects of those are. So it's really, really important. I understand why our inclination is to have conversation about the legislation, and I get that, but you cannot allow this to be so narrow that we overlook the other parts of the system that work in tandem for continued systemic oppression around criminal justice and Black people.
Yeah, and thank you for that. And I think what I often find myself saying is that we're not a monolith, right? And so there's much work for lots of people to do. So my question to you, Brother Coleman, would be, so 7 out of 10 people that are arrested are white. Then how do, besides, you know, you talk about the convictions, how do those numbers skew? So percentage-wise, given that we make up, 12% of the population, so what is that 3 out of 10 of Black people being arrested for, and how does that equate? Right. And so I think because you got to get to the point where the fact that prisons are filled with Black and brown bodies. So something's happening along the way. Now, we're not a monolith. So if we can work on all of those things as we proceed, getting back to this whole issue of defunding the police, I think the conversation initially gets hijacked. But when we talk about the conversation being hijacked, it's not just who we might think, right? It's not white folks. It wasn't, because there's a lot of, you know, Black folks coming out saying, well, we got to have the police, and, you know, and so what does defunding the police look like? And what exactly does it mean?
So that's a great question. And that, you brought up a point that I actually wanted to make but forgot. When I talk about violence and systemic violence against Black people on a psychological level, Black people have been conditioned to believe that we need the police. Like, we have been conditioned to believe that, like, yo, if we don't have police in our schools, if we don't have police in our neighborhoods, that everything is just gonna fall apart. That attitude, to Brother Jefferson's earlier point, is rooted in self-hatred and anti-Blackness. That is inherently an anti-Black sentiment, because what it does is it presupposes notions of criminality among all of us, such that if we don't have these overseers in our communities, in our schools, watching us, making sure we're doing what we're supposed to do, then we're just animals and we're never going to be able to figure it out. Now, is there going to be crime? Well, before we even answer that question, let's have a conversation about why crime occurs. Crime doesn't occur in poor neighborhoods, for example, because poor people like crime. Crime occurs in poor neighborhoods because people don't like being poor. So when you have an opportunity to defund the police, you can then divert those things into places that need them, like services to help people to get jobs, like opportunities to help people create jobs. For example, when people have other alternatives than, for example, crime, which oftentimes is the result of other occurrences where people feel like they don't have other options and they don't have other opportunities. So the idea of we need police or else we just gonna be shooting each other up, that is inherently anti-Black, and that is a matter of psychological violence that has conditioned us against ourselves, to be afraid of one another. And that's exactly what we involve police and law enforcement in so many situations that they are unequipped to handle, that they have not been trained for, and that they have no business being a part of. If we were able to help defund police and then fund mental health services for our community, if we were able to fund, substance abuse services for our community in greater numbers, that would give people opportunities to not have to engage law enforcement as frequently as we do around situations that they should never have been involved with in the first place. So again, it's about having a more sophisticated conversation and a detailed understanding about, well, why do we need police? What's the history behind there? What do police actually do? And is there a function, or is there a way that we as a community are able to minimize the necessity of the function of police? And the answer to the last question is, I believe it's yes. But when you defund police, in order to do that, the money has to come from somewhere. And the average taxpayer has no idea how much is actually spent on their police force annually. Like, I mean, let's really quickly, I want to make a point. Let's think about George Floyd. There's the situation with Elijah McClain in was it Utah?
Colorado.
In Colorado, thank you. In Colorado, right? We've already talked about the fact that in and of itself did not involve any reasonable suspicion that a crime was being occurred, right? It did not involve him being a suspect of any crime, or being even the 911 caller hadn't even accused him of committing a crime, right? So like, putting that aside, the fact that there was no need for law enforcement in that example. Let's think about this. For George Floyd, he was suspected of having passed a bad check. He was not suspected of being dangerous in any regard. He was not suspected of having a weapon on him or having threatened anyone. There were 4 officers who responded to that call. 4. All of them are on MLPS payroll, being paid by tax dollars of citizens in that community. You mean to tell me you needed 4 officers to respond to a threat, a suspected bad check, right? So I say all of that because the average person doesn't necessarily stop when they hear defund the police. They're like, who's gonna answer when we call 911? Like, that is not what we're talking about. We spend far too much on measures to create boundaries, if you will, to oversee our communities than we do to invest in our communities and provide pathways for people to live more fulfilling lives where we wouldn't even need to have this conversation in the first place.
And to add to that, I just want to add to that, to Coleman's point about being sophisticated, right, and having a sophisticated analysis. We need to expand our understanding of police violence, right? It's just as violent that police drain our social services and drain our city budgets, right? That when you say, Kevin, what does it mean to defund police? It looks a myriad of ways. Police, at least here in New Haven, the police who are in schools, that comes from a police budget, right? So we can erase that line item from the police budget and redirect those funds into adding more social workers and more coaches into schools, frankly, right? What does it look like to do that? What does it look like when we have police at functions that we don't need them at? We just had like a wonderful festival, a Juneteenth function right in East Rock Park here in New Haven, where police just stood around talking to each other, getting overtime, right? That, again, that drains the city budget. That's money in the city budget that could be used elsewhere, creating better services in our community, to Coleman's point, that doesn't get created. So that is also violent, right? To have something prey on our city budget and when our neighborhoods are historically and continuously divested from, right? And then we see our cities we see cities across America saying, and leadership, public officials in cities saying, well, let's bring in big development because we need a tax base because we don't have a tax base in our cities, right? So let's bring in big developers, and what that big development does is it creates luxury housing, and what that luxury housing when that luxury housing gets put up alongside our neighborhoods, right, it creates gentrification and displacement, further violence further state violence. So we can create funds in our communities by defunding some of these systems. It's egregious that Bridgeport has one of the most heavily funded police departments in the Gold Coast, right? And one of the poorest educational systems. That's violence too. That's just as violent as the officer jumping out his car shooting, right? Because that's hundreds and thousands of Black and brown children in Bridgeport not getting the education that frankly their peers get 10, 15 minutes out the county in Fairfield County. Fairfield County. So defunding the police looks, I think it looks a myriad of ways, and it's very tangible. As long as we engage in our local city budget process and advocate to limit those expenditures and to redirect those expenditures.
Yeah, and thanks for sharing that. And one of the things, so I had to, in full disclosure, when I first heard defund the police, I was like, man, what exactly does this mean? And like a lot of things, my wife put me up on it and kind of told me what it was. So we talk about immediately saying, oh, defund the police, like we can't have police, it's not, but no, reallocating the funds. But I just want to say the other day, and once I started thinking about that mindset, I had to tell you the other day I was on my way to work and I noticed that there was a young brother in a car and he was away from the light, but he was asleep. And I pulled over to go wake him up and someone said, he's asleep, should we call the cops? And my immediate reaction was like, no, don't call the cops. You know what I mean? Let's assess the situation ourselves, because we know that bringing them in, that man could have ended up dead like that young man in Atlanta, and so it's also a mindset as we begin to educate people on these things.
Or you could have wound up dead.
Right. You know what I mean?
That's the reality.
Yeah. So, it's definitely a different mindset and seeing things differently. So I appreciate it. This next one is for you, brother Jefferson. So 58 years ago, Malcolm X talked about the police as an occupying force after they shot and murdered some Muslim brothers outside a mosque in Los Angeles. And those words that Malcolm X saying today, whether it's on YouTube or you could download some of his speeches, ring true today. So what do we need to do as a community to get the police to, after we defund them and reallocate and get a different form of what that looks like, community protection looks like? How do we get that instead of us being occupied by a police state? I think that, and for me, really, how do we get New Haven and other cities not to be a police state?
Yeah, Kev, that's a great question. I really think it's simple, but it's difficult. If you just indulge me. The thing about it is organized power, and we don't have organized power. Brother Coleman is absolutely right what he addressed, and both him and Kerry did an excellent job talking about defunding the police, and that saved me some time. So, but about this, I want to talk about a point he made about the prosecutors and the judges, because he's absolutely right, because they're all part of the same system. The reality is we have to check every branch, every leg of that system, right? And the only way you do it is through politics. Let me just stick with Connecticut. And I know New Jersey and other places have different, they do things a little differently. But in Connecticut, the prosecutors are controlled, for lack of a better word, by the Criminal Justice Commission. That commission is made up of 6 people and the chief state's attorney, he's a non-voting member of the commission. They're the ones who choose the state's attorneys, the 13 state's attorneys that run the criminal justice system in the state of Connecticut. The governor appoints those 6 members. So you have to have influence over the governor in order to have your person appointed to that commission. Once you appoint, if you control that commission, and let's say a state's attorney botches a criminal investigation against the police, well, when their term comes up, they're out. They're out. And that sends a powerful message to all the other state's attorneys. Now, the Judicial Selection Committee is comprised of about 12 or 13 individuals, each selected by legislative leaders and the governor. So if you have influence over legislative leaders, you can have an individual who sits on that committee or in that commission that vets potential judges. See, that commission vets the judges and they pass their names on to the governor to be appointed. Now, that the individuals appointed still has to go through individuals like Gary Holder Winfield, who heads up the Judiciary Committee. You have to understand how the politics of all this work. And if we organize properly and we organize meticulously, we could have some influence over the very system that is hammering us. And we just don't get it. Our people don't get it. What's killing us, the internal enemy in our community, is apathy, particularly among Black males. Black males simply do not vote for whatever reason. We just don't vote. We're among all demographics, we are the least likely to vote. And that's a killer for us. And I'm not simply just saying we have to vote. We have to become sophisticated voters. Don't take this lightly, what I'm saying. Because if you're asking us to change the system, that's exactly how you change the system. To control it from top to bottom, at least have influence over that. You think about it. If we had that kind of influence, we could say, we want this person, we want Kevin Walton on the Judicial Selection Committee. We want Carrie Ellington on the Criminal Justice Commission. Imagine that. We want Ruel Dixon on Board of Police Commissioners. Imagine that. Imagine it, if you will. Thank you.
Can I add?
Sure.
I just want to offer a slight different thinking on it in terms of apathy, because I do, when you ask Kevin the next step in the movement, Michael just helped me to think of it. I think it's one, building a network around our state, that when we look to New York, when we look at big cities, we see a strong grass movement or grassroots organizing movement, or at least from Little Old Connecticut folks, it seems strong, right? That is really built to address those different issues from a local level to a state level. And I think that in Connecticut, due to the particular landscape of the have and have-nots, and the really racist landscape here, that it is really hard to, especially for folks in communities on the ground that have been reacting to state-sanctioned violence, it keeps us in a very reactionary place, right? When we're like, oh, yo, someone just got, right, killed in Bridgeport, or someone was murdered in New Britain, right? It keeps us in a place where we're like, how do we respond in that moment? And I think it's important for our movement to grow a network in a way that helps to leverage an agenda that Michael is speaking of, right? It's not okay that in addition to everything Michael just laid out, that the chief state's attorney is not elected, that the chief state's attorney is appointed, and that the chief state's attorney's office, who investigates misconduct by public law enforcement officials, does that investigation and cannot be FOIA'd, right? That investigation is not transparent to those who pay taxes here in this state. That's unacceptable, because that allows for that office to work and do these investigations behind an ivory tower. In addition to the level of or the way that it cannot be permeated because of the nuances that Michael just spoke to, right? That these folks are appointed, not elected, and it's layered. So I think we need a statewide agenda around police violence. We need a local agendas and regional agendas in Connecticut around police violence, because we have 169 municipalities. So what does it look like in a state that has 169 jurisdictions with probably 169 different police departments? What does it look like to organize on, and how do we challenge the power of the union in the state? Frankly, the union is super powerful, the police union in Connecticut. How do we challenge and get at that? So I just want to offer that we need to really form stronger networks, and that those networks need to center those most marginalized, right? And not necessarily, I think traditionally they have centered folks who want to do reformist work, but not folks who are really saying, look, you are killing us on the ground and you must stop now. And here are our demands, right? So what does it look like to be in company with those folks, right? But to have folks who are really impacted by these issues lead that movement and demand the changes that need to be demanded uncompromised.
You're muted, bro. Kevin, you're muted.
I'm sorry, you know, I took it off because of the motorcycles outside. So listen, we you know, this is, you all have said a mouthful, and I promise you all this is going to be powerful. Let me do this though. We have a lot of conversations and questions going on in the chat. So I'm going to turn it over to Ruel, and he can give our panelists a couple of questions out of the chat room.
All right, so one comment that popped up in here, they're saying that in North Carolina, it takes someone who wants to be a barber longer to become licensed to be a barber than it is to be a cop in North Carolina. So I thought that was just an interesting comment that we have here. We have a lot of questions in here, brother Kevin, that it's kind of speaking to a lot of the stuff that we've talked about before. So I don't know if you necessarily have another set of questions that will move us in another direction. You can defund the police unions in lieu of defunding the police departments. That's what one person stated in here. One person was saying removing the qualified immunity clause within the police departments. You know, how do we go about doing that? You know, I mean, essentially doing that. So police.
Well, I want to jump in there.
Go ahead.
You know, I sort of didn't comment directly on either of the reform pieces. Because again, I think that's actually the wrong conversation. I realize it's the conversation in front of us, but I think that's not entirely the right conversation. But what I will say on both of those pieces in terms of my response, and this is my former prosecutor background talking, if we are not having a conversation about qualified immunity being reduced, if not altogether abolished, everything else does not matter. Like that is a conversation right now. If we're going to talk about police reform, and that's going to be, if we're going to limit that, right? You know what I'm saying? And I get it. Like the whole conversation about abolition of police is probably very radical for some people, and that's going to take some selling. I understand that. But if we're at the point that we are having a conversation about police reform, none of us should have talking points that do not include qualified immunity being eliminated. Because at the end of the day, I forget who made the point. They made the point about Dylan Roof, so on and so forth. I mean, you don't got to go that far, right? Police know how to. I'm in Brooklyn, New York, and what I can tell you, if you know anything about Brooklyn, New York, and the following neighborhoods that I'm about to mention, I don't have to explain this any further. When the police go to Williamsburg, when the police go to Borough Park, they know how to act. It's the same NYPD. It's not somebody different. They know how to act when they go to Williamsburg, when they go to Borough Park. If you don't understand what I'm saying, go Google those neighborhoods and the demographics in those neighborhoods, and it'll be a little bit more clear.
Brother Coleman, can you add in there what is qualified immunity? So if some people don't know what it is.
Qualified immunity essentially exempts police officers from being responsible for actions that they may take, regardless of the degree of harm, if they're done in the commission of their job. So, for example, it's a shield. It's for all intents and purposes, it's a shield that protects them within the justice system from doing their job, from liability on the civil end, and even to some degree liability on the criminal end in certain regards.
Could I just add to that, Brother Coleman? It's a legal doctrine. It's not a law. It's a legal doctrine established by the Supreme Court back in the late 60s or so, just to do just that. And unless the plaintiff could show that the official violated clearly established statutory or constitutional rights of which a reasonable person should have known, and whether the law is clearly established depends on whether the case law has addressed it. So if if it hasn't been addressed in case law, something that the police has done, then they most likely will win. And it's not just something that they, you know, similar. I mean, it has to almost be exact.
And it's and you know, Brother Jefferson, being a far better attorney than I am, you know, gave you the legalese on that. But you know, that's exactly what it does. And even as it's laid out, Brother Jefferson laid out the actual legal elements for qualified immunity as a doctrine, what I can tell you as a civil rights attorney is that it is extremely difficult to get a judge to recognize when those constitutional rights have been violated. Like it's very, very, very hard to get beyond qualified immunity in terms of holding officers liable. And so that doctrine being in place is something that is incredibly problematic, because what I have found at the end of the day, you only get accountability when there are consequences. And there are no consequences for the abuse of Black bodies by law enforcement. And that is why we continue to see what we continue to see writ large from law enforcement in America. There are not consequences, and qualified immunity is a significant barrier to having those consequences exist and enforced. So as far as I'm concerned, if we're not talking about qualified immunity as part of police reform, y'all can keep your chokeholds, y'all can keep everything else, your databases, you can keep your training, you can keep all that. You can keep all that. Because at the end of the day, what we're gonna see is the same end result, right? Without there being anything different, because there's nothing different on the back end to actually enforce and hold folks accountable.
Okay. All right. So so we're about 7 minutes out. So what we're going to do is begin to wrap this thing up. Again, I want to thank our panelists. It's been powerful. We could have done this all night. We may have to do a part 2. But so I think the last question, we could take us out on this, because we've spoken a lot about different strategies, and we didn't even get to the legislative part of this thing, but we talked about becoming sophisticated voters and educated voters, and educate ourselves around organizing and defunding the police. So lots of things on the table, but Kerry, what's the thing, what do we need to do to be able to leverage the power that we have within this community, within our community?
I think we spoke to some of those things already. I think, and we got into somewhat of a nuanced conversation I would love to keep having around being inclusive, but I think we'll leverage power the more inclusive we are as a community. We'll leverage power the more illiterate and critical and sophisticated in our analysis as we are, you know, in our community, as we spoke to earlier. I think that those things are really critical, that we continue dialogues like this. And we create spaces, you know, where we can be informed. I think that we will only leverage our power. I think dialogue and relationship is critical, especially working within proximity, when we're working within our local jurisdictions and statewide. Because oftentimes what happens is the powers that be come in and find someone they can tokenize to compromise and to say that, right, that they are going to fix or alleviate whatever the problem may be concerning policing. And that's oftentimes like a smoke screen. I think we need to stop, you know, we need to figure out ways that we can hold people and leaders in our community accountable to a true, authentic agenda and not to a compromise agenda. So I think dialogue is really critical to making that happen, relationship building, in addition to building an inclusive movement and self-investigating our consciousness, right? What are our beliefs around safety and crime and punishment? Because a lot, to Coleman's point, right? A lot of what we believe to be true about policing is just like romanticized. It's not actually true. There's no actual assessment that police actually, I mean, not only is there not assessment, but police don't keep us safe, right? And there's no actual data or assessment that shows that they make a difference in a way that the police, this institution of police claims to. We've been frankly conditioned by way of media and by way of other means to believe in policing when we see the reality of it in our communities every day. So I think we have to really investigate ourselves, investigate our ideas of punishment and what we believe to be really, rehabilitative. And to do some internal and intracommunal work together to really build and leverage a stronger movement than the movements that we have, which have been strong, but we have a potential to have a much more strong movement.
Thank you. Brother Coleman, same question. What do we need to do to leverage our power? Thank you, Kerry.
You know, and maybe Kerry just said this, and I'm just saying it a different way. I think that it is a combination of education and imagination. And what I mean by that is we need to truly educate ourselves. I understand that as a people, we are very passionate and very emotional, but we need to go into these conversations with facts over feelings, right? Like we are driven, and let me be clear. Again, you know, for me, the political memory piece is a very critical one because the emotional violence and the psychological violence that has been perpetuated against us has conditioned us in a way that most normal human beings would respond emotionally because, quite frankly, we are sick and tired. So I do understand that, but that can't override a lust or a passion, rather, for facts. And we have to arm ourselves with facts in order to be sophisticated in how we engage and understanding how we engage. And then, so that's the education piece. The imagination piece is we have to allow ourselves to think about what being in America would look like from the ground up. Not like, oh, if we can just tweak this over here, then everything will be okay, right? Like there is a reason why disruption and why, you know, burning this down resonates with folks. Because in terms of what it is that we as Black people think we're protecting in terms of this system or the system that we're trying to subtly tweak or operate from within, it ain't worth saving. It's just not. And so part of what keeps us from moving forward in terms of embracing and exploring and interrogating other ideas is the unknown, is the fear of the unknown, because it's not something that we know. It's like, well, if we don't have police, what would we have? I don't know. What would we have, right? We would have a responsibility to do better among ourselves with each other. We would have a responsibility for like personal accountability and like real community. Imagine what that would look like. But you have to be open to it. You have to really be able to imagine something differently. And I know for a lot of us, that's hard. That's really hard because we have had such psychological violence perpetuated against us that the way we see ourselves is that we don't see ourselves as even being capable of that. But that's so anti-Black and it's so dangerous and it's so destructive, right? So a huge part of the imagination piece is self-love and like realizing like who we are and how we see each other and how we see ourselves. Because if we can unlock those chains and open those doors, then we create space for us to have a different type of conversation about imagining an entirely different system, an entirely different space, and an entirely different community. So for me, it's education and imagination.
Brother, you painted the picture so vividly, so we appreciate you. And then we'll have Brother District Representative Mike Jefferson with the final word this evening.
Yeah, those Kerry and Brother Coleman they stole my thunder. They just laid it all out. I can only just briefly just dovetail on what they have so eloquently stated, and I thank both of them for being here this evening. It's been a pleasure sharing the platform with them. The Kiyama movement, our motto is forget about them, think about us. Forget about them, think about us. We have to think about us. Forget about them. They're going to do what they're going to do. They've been doing it for 400 years, time immemorial. I don't see them changing. It's just, why should they? They're in control. They love it. And, you know, most are not driven to change. Those who are, I seek an alliance with the anti-racist whites, anti-racist whites, anti-racist whites. That's who I would seek an alliance with in the white community, because they're on that journey to confront racism in their own community. That's what they're about. They're about confronting racism in their own community. I have an unconditional love for Black people, and that's why I fight for Black people. And if you fight for Black people, you better love us, because, you know, at times we're going to break your heart. We just will. We're just going to break your heart, and because it's so much damage has been done, and you have to be able to survive that and to overcome what comes with leadership in our community. And you have to have this sense of compassion, a sense of nobility in leading Black people. You know, everything starts with leadership. And I think Black leadership, quite frankly, has failed Black people. This has failed Black people. So I think if you're going to jump out there as a leader, you better be prepared to lead, and you better love Black people, or don't jump out there. I think the issue of teaching our people and helping our people become sophisticated voters, understanding the political process, is essential for us to move forward. We have to understand politics. We cannot take politics lightly. We have to understand it. I think that is the key to make, and that's what I'm gonna spend, you know, the next few years of my life, is trying to create sophisticated voters in our community, because I think that is the answer. Controlling the apparatus that impact the lives of Black people, particularly the apparatus that controls law enforcement, from the police to the prosecutors to the judges. That's how we deal effectively with police misconduct and police brutality in our community. And last but not least, I do want to say, I want to thank the brothers of EII. I really, really do. This is, I've been on several Zoom conversations since this COVID pandemic had hit, and since the George Floyd tragedy. And this just has been one of the best platforms that I've had the opportunity to talk about a lot of these issues. So I want to thank the brothers of EII, and please feel free to invite me back. I hope we gave you what you wanted this evening. We certainly tried.
If you give us any more, we might have to pay you, brother. Listen, I just want to just take this time before I turn it back over to the bossless, to thank everybody for tonight. Like I said, we could have gone on. We have so much going on in the chat room, but we want to respect your time. I just want to thank Carrie Ellington, who was just doing a marvelous job of just kind of holding people accountable, and she's in those streets. You know, she had me and my family up on I-95, so you know we'll follow her.
Oh no.
Of course, Brother Coleman, who had to jump off, who's a good friend of ours here in our chapter. He's a good friend in Connecticut. And then, of course, Brother Mike Jefferson, who for years has been bringing the fire. We brought the Rebel out tonight, and I'm just elated with this panel and the way this thing went. But we have so much work to do. And in lieu of time, I just want to thank the Social Action Committee for all the work on this, and the brother Bossless, Alex Jones, for having the confidence in us to put this series on. So with that, thank you all. Thank you to our audience for your participation, your questions. Sorry we couldn't get to everyone, but we'll be back in a couple of weeks with another panel, and we hope people come back out. So Brother Jones, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Brother Walton. Thank you for your expertise and your willingness to lead the Social Action Committee as well. Definitely a great job you're doing there. Thanks to the committee. Brother Jefferson, thank you. Brother, Sister Ellington, thank you as well. And to our attendees, thank you for coming out and giving us your time. We definitely appreciate it. We hope to see you in a few weeks. God bless everybody. Good night.
Good night.
Good night, everyone. All right. AJ, are we going to meet on another?
No, I can stop this so we can stay on this platform real quick.
Yeah, I think we just have a few more people that's exiting.
All right.
As far as I see, I think we good, dog. Because Jasmine's that's Brother Streeter, so we good.
Yeah,
All
that
right.
I'm just stopping this.